As I stepped into the house that evening, the last thing I expected to find was Sophia sitting at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face. It was completely out of character for her. My stepmother, Sophia, had always been the picture of composure, even somewhat distant. She wasn't the type to let her emotions overflow like this. Yet, there she was, her shoulders shaking and her face buried in her hands, sobbing quietly. For a moment I was frozen. The soft glow of the kitchen light illuminated her silhouette, and the air felt thick with unspoken words. I wanted to turn around and pretend I hadn't seen her like this, but something stopped me. Despite all the emotional distance that had always existed between us, I couldn't just walk away. "Sophia," I said softly as I took a step closer. At first, she didn't answer, and for a moment, I wondered if she had even heard me. But slowly, she lifted her head, her tear-streaked face glimmering in the light. The expression in her eyes was a mixture of fear, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Before I knew it, I was right beside her, my hand resting gently on her shoulder, unsure of what else to do. She flinched slightly at my touch but didn't pull away. Instead, she turned to face me, and without any warning, she leaned in. It all happened so fast that I didn't have time to process it. Her lips brushed against mine in a soft, desperate kiss. I could feel her trembling, her breath catching as she pulled away almost instantly, her eyes wide with shock at what had just occurred. Neither of us spoke. I couldn't find the words. My thoughts were racing. Sophia, my stepmother, had just kissed me. Felt completely wrong. Everything about it was wrong. Yet, in that moment, the weight of what had just happened hung in the air like a dense fog, and neither of us knew how to dispel it. She quickly stood up, her chair scraping across the floor with a harsh sound that shattered the silence. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, she hurried past me and out of the kitchen, leaving me there, stunned and more confused than I had ever been. The house felt colder, emptier somehow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed in an irreversible way. The next morning, everything felt different. Since that night, Sophia and I had hardly crossed paths, and when we did, it was only a fleeting moment of eye contact before we both looked away. The atmosphere between us felt heavy, saturated with unspoken thoughts that neither of us dared to acknowledge. A week had passed since the kiss, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I wasn't sure if she felt the same way, but her avoidance spoke volumes. That brief moment replayed in my mind, the warmth of her lips and the urgency of her touch. Yet the confusion that followed made it impossible to understand. Then, on a rainy afternoon, I came home to find her standing outside by her car, staring down at the ground. She hadn't noticed me approaching at first. I considered just walking past her, pretending I didn't see her, but something inside me compelled me to stop. "Sophia," I called out. She turned, and before I could think it through, she walked toward me, her eyes reflecting an emotion I couldn't decipher. There was a pause, just long enough for us both to recognize what was about to unfold. Then she kissed me again. This time, it wasn't frantic but laden with everything we had been avoiding. Weeks passed, yet nothing felt normal. That kiss lingered between us like an inescapable shadow. I tried to brush it off, to act as if it had never happened. But the truth was I couldn't. Every time I saw Sophia, that moment replayed in my mind. The warmth of her lips and the way she looked at me made it clear we were crossing a line we shouldn't. Yet there was no turning back. We hardly spoke now. It felt as if the whole house had descended into a state of tense silence. My father remained blissfully unaware, busy with work and always on the go. He never noticed the prolonged silences between Sophia and me or how we seemed to avoid being in the same room for too long. If he did, he never mentioned it. As for Sophia, she had withdrawn even further into herself. Physically present, she was emotionally distant, as if she were locked away in some invisible room. The worst part was that I should have felt a sense of relief that we weren't discussing it. I should have been glad we were ignoring what had happened, but I wasn't. The tension gnawed at me every time I saw her, and I could tell it was doing the same to her. One evening, After my father had left for another business trip, the silence became unbearable. Sophia sat alone in the living room, engrossed in a book that she clearly wasn't focused on. I stood in the doorway, torn between saying something or simply leaving. The room was dim, the only light coming from the lamp beside her, casting long shadows on the walls. I stepped forward, clearing my throat, and Sophia looked up, her eyes widening slightly as if I had startled her. "Sophia," I began, hesitating. "We need to talk." She gently closed the book and placed it on the table beside her. For a brief moment, she just stared at me, and I could see the conflict etched across her face. There was something unreadable in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or regret, but also an emotion that felt too much like longing. "I know," she finally admitted, her voice so soft I almost didn't catch it. "I've been thinking about it too." Her confession hung between us, thick and heavy. I wasn't sure how to proceed or what to say, but I understood that we couldn't keep pretending nothing had happened. "I'm not sure what this is," I murmured, my voice soft and cautious. "But it's clearly affecting both of us." Sophia leaned back in her chair, releasing a long, slow breath as if she had been holding it for an eternity. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, Liam," she admitted, her eyes downcast. "A lot of them. But what happened between us?" Her voice trailed off, words stuck in her throat. I stepped a little closer, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I knew I shouldn't be so near her, that this proximity was wrong. Yet I couldn't bring myself to back away. "We both understand this was a mistake," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I can't seem to let it go." That was the truth we had been skirting around for weeks. Neither of us could escape it. The room felt like it was closing in on us, the walls pushing us together. There was no simple way out, no way to untangle this mess. I could feel the magnetic pull between us, the same pull I had felt since our first kiss. "What are we supposed to do now?" I asked, aware that no straightforward answer existed. Sophia didn't respond immediately. She glanced down at her hands, then looked back at me, her eyes searching, perhaps looking for the courage to voice what neither of us wanted to confront. Before she could speak, I sensed the atmosphere shift. The tension that had always lingered between us broke like a wave crashing onto the shore. "I don't know," she finally admitted, her voice shaking. "I honestly don't know if there's anything we can do about it." I hadn't realized how close I had gotten until I stood right in front of her, close enough to see the tears pooling in her eyes. For a brief moment, I thought she might get up and leave, but she remained there, rooted in place by some unseen force that kept us together in that moment. "I don't want to hurt him," she said suddenly, her voice breaking. "Your father? He deserves better than this." Her words hit me like a punch, and for a moment, guilt washed over me, cold and consuming. She was right. My father, blissfully unaware of the chaos in his own home, didn't deserve this betrayal. But what could we possibly do? The harm had already been done. Instinctively, I reached for her hand, intertwining my fingers with hers. It was a small act, but it felt like crossing yet another line we couldn't uncross. She didn't pull away, and for a fleeting moment, everything hung in the balance, as if we were the only two people in existence. But the reality of our situation loomed over us, reminding us that consequences awaited, even if we weren't ready to confront them. The silence that settled between us was thicker this time, as we sat there, ensnared in the consequences of our choices, unsure of our next steps. Days turned into a blur, with neither of us willing to acknowledge what had been said, much less what had occurred between us. My father returned, blissfully ignorant of the tension that had infiltrated our home. Every meal felt fraught with unspoken words, each moment pregnant with a silence that threatened to crack open at any second. I did my best to avoid Sophia, but it proved futile. She was always nearby, in the kitchen, in the living room, moving quietly as if trying not to draw attention to herself. Yet, every time I saw her, that night replayed in my mind, the look in her eyes, the tremor in her voice as she spoke of my father. One evening, after my father left for another work trip, I found myself alone with her in the house. I hadn't intended to engage her, but when I spotted her by the window, staring into the dark abyss outside, something shifted inside me. I walked closer, just enough for her to sense my presence without getting too close. The silence felt suffocating, pressing down on us like a weight. "We can't keep doing this," I finally said, my voice low and steady. She didn't turn to face me, but I could see her shoulders tense in response. "I know," she whispered, yet neither of us moved. The next day felt precarious, as if everything was teetering on a thin thread. I couldn't tell if it was just me feeling this way or if Sophia sensed it too, but the tension between us was nearly unbearable. Every encounter felt charged with unexpressed thoughts and feelings we both avoided acknowledging. It wasn't until that evening that everything came to a head. My father had gone out for dinner with colleagues, leaving just Sophia and me in the house. She was sitting on the couch, flipping through the pages of a book she clearly wasn't absorbing. I lingered in the doorway for a moment, observing her, trying to decide my next move. I knew we couldn't continue pretending everything was fine, but I wasn't sure how to address it, or if there was even a way to fix it. "Sophia," I said softly as I stepped into the room. She didn't look up, but I noticed her grip on the book tighten. "We can't keep doing this." I repeated the words from the previous night, but this time they hung in the air unanswered, just the weighty silence filling the gap between us. I stepped closer, feeling the tension intensify with each movement. "I don't know what this is," I confessed, struggling to articulate my feelings. "But it's consuming me." That statement finally got through to her. Sophia looked up, her eyes wide with surprise as if she hadn't anticipated my admission. For a moment, silence enveloped us. I could see the internal struggle on her face, the fear and guilt that had plagued her since our first kiss. Yet, there was also something deeper, a yearning that hadn't vanished despite the circumstances. She stood, the book slipping from her fingers, forgotten on the floor. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. This isn't right." "I know," I replied, moving closer. "But I can't stop thinking about you, about us." Sophia took a step back, confusion and perhaps even panic dancing in her eyes. "We can't," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Your father," I started, but I quickly interrupted myself. "I know, but it's not just that. Whatever is happening between us, it's genuine. We can't pretend it doesn't exist anymore." For a moment, she stood there, her breath shallow, as if she were trying to hold herself together. I could see it in her eyes. She wanted to walk away and put an end to this before it escalated further. But instead, she did the exact opposite. She closed the gap between us, her eyes locked onto mine. The room felt like it was closing in, the space between us evaporating as she reached up to gently touch my face. It was a simple gesture, yet it felt like the breaking point we had been edging toward. Her touch was soft and hesitant but carried the weight of everything we hadn't expressed. Then, without uttering another word, she kissed me. This kiss was different from the ones before. It wasn't desperate or tinged with fear. It was slow and intentional, as if we were finally surrendering to something that had been building for far too long. It felt inevitable, as if this moment had been destined to occur. Despite our efforts to avoid it, when we finally pulled apart, the room seemed to exhale with us. Sophia's eyes glistened with tears, but she didn't wipe them away. She remained there, breathing heavily, her hand still resting against my cheek. "This is wrong," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," I replied, my own voice thick with emotion. "But I don't regret it." She looked away, her hand slipping down to her side. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I had no answer. How could I? Nothing about this situation made sense. Yet it felt like the only thing that mattered in that moment. We stood there, frozen in time, neither of us willing to break the silence. Finally, Sophia stepped back, her face a mask of conflict. "I need some time," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I need to think." I nodded, even though I knew that thinking wouldn't change what had happened or how we felt. She turned and left the room without another word, leaving me standing there, my heart racing, wondering how we had let things get this far and where it would all lead. The following days blurred together. Sophia and I spoke barely a word to each other, and when we did, it was reduced to awkward pleasantries. It felt as if we were tiptoeing around each other, trying to erase the last few weeks from our minds. But no matter how hard we tried, the weight of it all lingered in the air, impossible to ignore. Sophia left for a few days, saying something about visiting an old friend in another town. When she departed, I felt a rush of relief mixed with a strange emptiness. I hoped that her absence would provide me with the clarity I needed, a chance to breathe without the suffocating tension that had enveloped us. But it didn't. Her absence only intensified my feelings. I couldn't stop thinking about her. Every quiet moment and every time I passed the living room where we had stood so close, everything came rushing back. The guilt gnawed at me, but so did an undeniable longing. It made no sense. Nothing about this situation did. Yet I couldn't shake it. I tried to immerse myself in work, hanging out with friends, anything to keep my mind off Sophia. But it was futile. Every distraction felt temporary, like I was just waiting for her return, waiting for the moment we would have to confront whatever this was between us again. When Sophia finally came back, the atmosphere in the house felt even more electric. She barely said a word, just a quiet greeting as she walked by me. I watched her pass, feeling that familiar tug in my chest, that gnawing sense that we were spiraling toward something uncontrollable. That evening, as we both sat quietly in separate rooms, I realized it wasn't just about avoiding each other. It was about dodging the truth. The truth that we couldn't undo what had happened, and that no matter how hard we tried to pretend, it was already too late. Upon Sophia's return, the air felt thicker than before. We didn't mention her time away, but the distance between us had morphed into something more fragile. It was as if the unspoken tension had become an invisible thread, tightening day by day. Deep down, I knew we couldn't maintain this indefinitely. Eventually, the thread would snap. That evening, the house was unnervingly quiet. My father was away again, leaving us alone just like before. I found myself pacing my room, grappling with the decision to confront her. It was time to really talk, to address the avoidance and the tension that was suffocating me. I needed to know where we stood, even if it meant things would never be the same again. I walked downstairs and found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of tea before her. She looked exhausted, worn down by whatever had been weighing heavily on her these past few weeks. I hesitated but took a deep breath and sat across from her. "We can't keep doing this," I said softly, breaking the silence. My voice came out more desperate than I had intended. Sophia looked up, her eyes mirroring the same weariness I had seen for weeks. She didn't respond right away, simply watching me as if she were weighing whether to let me in. "I know," she finally whispered. "I've been trying to figure out how to stop this." Her words struck me hard. I wasn't sure if I felt relief or terror. "Do you want to stop?" I asked, my heart racing as the question hung in the air. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. "We have to," she said, but it didn't sound like a true answer. It felt more like a duty, something we knew we should do, but it didn't reflect her true desires. The room felt too small, too confining. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, searching for the right words to express what I had been holding back. "Sophia, I don't know what this is, but I can't pretend it didn't happen. I can't just go back." Her eyes widened, and she looked at me with a mix of fear and something deeper, something unspoken that lingered beneath the surface. "Neither can I," she admitted, her voice cracking. "But if we keep going down this path, we'll destroy everything." There it was, the truth we had been dodging. We had been avoiding the looming destruction that threatened not only us but everything and everyone in our lives. My father, the family, the life we had been pretending was so normal. I spoke softly, the weight of my words hanging heavily in the air. I knew how dangerous they were, but I couldn't continue lying. Not to myself or to her. Sophia rose from her seat, each movement slow and purposeful, as if she were grappling with an internal struggle with every step. She walked over to the window and gazed into the darkness, her back turned to me. "I don't either," she whispered, almost too softly to hear. I got to my feet and approached her, uncertain about what I might say or do. All I knew was that I couldn't let her walk away from this conversation without some kind of resolution. As I neared her, she turned to face me, and we found ourselves closer than we had been in weeks. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what this means, of what we've already done." "So am I," I replied. "But ignoring it isn't an option." We stood there, suspended in silence, the tension between us thickening with every heartbeat. I could feel that same pull, the magnetic force that had drawn us together from the start, pushing us toward something we could not reverse. Then, without thinking, I closed the gap and kissed her again. This kiss wasn't fueled by confusion or fear. It was intentional, filled with all the words we had never said. When we finally broke apart, she looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and acceptance. "This can't continue," she murmured, though her hand lingered on my arm, as if reluctant to let go. "I know," I replied softly, my voice heavy with the gravity of our situation. "But we need to decide what comes next." Sophia didn't answer. Instead, she turned away and walked slowly out of the room. I watched her fade into the shadows, understanding that whatever lay ahead would change everything, whether we were ready for it or not. The house was eerily quiet again, too quiet. My father had left early that morning for yet another business trip, leaving Sophia and me alone once more. But this time felt different. The weight of everything that had transpired between us bore down on me more than ever. I hadn't spoken to her since our last encounter, where our unfinished words had hung heavy in the air. I couldn't stop replaying the moments we had shared, the closeness, how we had crossed lines we never intended to, and yet it felt like there was no resolution in sight. That afternoon, I heard her footsteps in the hallway. She paused outside my door, as if hesitating before knocking. I held my breath, waiting and hoping. To my surprise, she gently pushed the door open, her face partially obscured by the dim light. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice quiet and uncertain. I nodded, rising from the bed, unsure of what to expect. Sophia stepped into the room, softly closing the door behind her. She didn't look at me right away. She simply stood there, her hands clasped together as if she were trying to steady herself. "Liam," she began, finally locking eyes with me. I need to leave." I froze, struggling to comprehend her words. "What do you mean?" "I have to go," she said, her voice quavering. "I've been thinking about it for a while now. What's been happening between us? It's wrong. We both know it." Her words struck me like a physical blow. I felt as if the ground had fallen out from under me, yet I couldn't argue with her. Deep down, I knew she was right. We had crossed too many boundaries, and there was no way back. But hearing her articulate it out loud was what truly stung. "Where will you go?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know yet, but I have to leave before this spirals further." I wanted to plead with her to stay, to figure things out together, but the words escaped me. There was nothing left to say that could mend this. We both understood this was the only way to halt the chaotic spiral we had fallen into. Sophia took a step closer, her face filled with sadness. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "I know," I replied, my throat tight with emotion. "Neither did I." For a moment we simply stood there, the silence between us thicker than ever. Then, before I could think twice, I reached out and took her hand in mine. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. In that moment, everything else faded into the background. I leaned in and kissed her. A soft, tender kiss that felt like our final goodbye. There was no urgency, no confusion, just a mutual understanding that this was the last time we would share something like this. When I pulled back, Sophia let out a shaky breath, her hand still resting on mine. She stepped back, wiping her eyes, and I realized this was the end. There was nothing more to be said. "I'll be gone by tomorrow," she whispered, turning toward the door. "Take care of yourself, Liam." And just like that, she slipped out of the room, leaving as quietly as she had entered. The door clicked shut behind her, and I stood there, staring at the empty space where she had been. The silence settled in, and I understood that everything had changed. We had reached a point of no return, and there was no going back.